Hi guys, you've been Century and welcome back to another video, and today we are going to be looking at the 5 Doctors, which is the 20th anniversary special for Doctor Who, which came obviously at the end of the 20th season of Doctor Who. So, a bit of history and context behind this story before we actually get into the bulk of it. Doctor Who, first off, Doctor Who had been going for 10 years. And at the 10th season, it was John Pertwee's fourth season, as the Doctor. And the people, producer Barry Letts and stuff, decided to create a special to commemorate them in the milestone, bringing back Patrick Troughton to return as the role of the second Doctor, and for a short time, William Hartnell returns in what is now the 3 Doctors, which I might review later on, but yeah, it's quite a good story. And I'm going to compare, there's going to be points where I compare the 3 Doctors to the 5 Doctors, so, yeah, it's more of it's going to be a review of the 5 Doctors, but more of a comparison. But then, after they released the 3 Doctors, which was probably quite a success at the time, then obviously the show went on. Pertwee left the role subsequently a year later, and Tom Baker then got the role. Tom Baker played the Doctor for a significant amount of years, then left, and Pete Davison finally got the role as the Doctor. And then that was about 10 years after the third 3 Doctors, and we got the 5 Doctors now as 5 Doctors. Now, obviously, originally, this script was created by Robert Holmes, and he wrote a script, but unfortunately, a bulk of his script contained Tom Baker as more or less the main Doctor in the story. However, Tom Baker would not return to this story for one reason or another, and so Terrance Dicks had to quickly rewrite the script to accommodate for the fact that Tom Baker's not in it, to give the other 3 and a bit Doctors to kind of have a bit more screen presence. So yeah, we're going to start off with some of the positives about the story. Obviously, it's an amazing story. It's an amazing celebration of the year of the Doctor Who. I mean, you've got Troughton back, you've got Pertwee back, the Master appears in it as Anthony Ainley's Master appears in it, the Cybermen are in it, Daleks are in it. We have more backstory to Gallifrey. We kind of meet a new villain, which only really appears in this, called I believe it's Androvax robot or something like that. And obviously a lot of companions return, such as Sarah Jane Smith, Tegan, obviously, and Turlough were actually at that time the companions. Also, the Brigadier's back. Who else? Yeah, I think that's it. Sarah Jane Smith, the Brigadier, Owen Susan as well, with a couple more cameo appearances from Mike Yates, Liz Shaw, Zoe Harriott, and Jamie McCrimmon. So, obviously, quite a good celebration of the show, which I think, as a comparison, is more of the celebration of the show as the 3 Doctors, because 3 Doctors, apart from bringing Troughton and Hartnell back, didn't really bring anything else new. But yeah, good history of the show. It has a lot of history behind it. ONK9 makes return and stuff, but unfortunately, I think it's quite a flawed story, and there's a lot of reasons why it's quite flawed, so we need to get into those now. First off, I think, obviously, the biggest elephant in the room is the fact that Tom Baker said he did not want to return to the role. Now, there's conflicting arguments between this. I think a big argument for it is he wasn't a fan of the producer at the time, so he left in season 18 when John Nathan Turner started, and he wasn't a fan of John Nathan Turner, and so since John Nathan Turner was still producer of the show, he kind of didn't want to come back. Another argument is that Tom Baker felt that he literally left 2 seasons ago, so he didn't feel like he wanted to return to the role straight away, which is fair enough considering he did do 7 seasons. But Troughton and Pertwee return, and obviously Davison was still in that role. However, unfortunately, again, Hartnell had died by this point in time, so he was not very well when he had to leave the role in the 10th Planet. He was well enough to do a little tiny bit in the Three Doctors, but he wasn't appearing in it as much. But then, obviously, by this point he died, so they got a man called Richard Herndl to come in and replace him, with Hartnell appearing at the beginning to do his famous speech from Dalek's Invasion of Earth as the only of like a homage to him. So obviously that means that for a lot of fans of the time, Tom Baker fans who literally watched him do it and are excited, who've heard of the Three Doctors and know that the Doctor's return stuff, were probably quite upset that he didn't return. I mean, Hartnell maybe is not as much, but I think some people might have been confused why Hartnell looked like that, considering why there was two different looking Hartnells, possibly. Another thing that always confused me in this was the companion pairings. So first off, you have Richard Herndl and Carol Ann Ford's as their first Doctor and Susan, which is a fine pair. I mean, it makes sense. Susan's granddaughter and the Doctor. But I think I'm going to get on to Susan in the second after I name the others that are a bit confusing. Then you've got the second Doctor and the Brigadier. Now, these are where I kind of got confused. The second Doctor and the third Doctor are the ones which are really a bit confusing. So for the second Doctor, you've got the Brigadier, a well-known character. He's not like and he's not an obscure character. However, it was an odd choice to bring him back as the lead with the second Doctor, rather than someone who's iconic for being with him, like Jamie and Zoe. Because it's not like the second Doctor never met him. He met him in the Three Doctors, in the Web of Fear and in the Invasion, but there was 3 stories compared to Pertwee, who had more stories with the Brigadier in his first season. Then we move on to Pertwee, who was paired with Elizabeth Sladen, who I have a feeling was possibly contracted to do this story, and then Tom Baker said he wasn't going to come back, and they had to rewrite the script, and then she got stuck with Pertwee instead. Because not to say they're a bad pair, but when I talk about Elizabeth Sladen, people think of her in Sarah Jane Adventures and stuff, but they also think of her as Tom Baker's companion, not John Pertwee's companion. And it's not like they have bad chemistry, they have decent chemistry, it's just odd. And then I think it amplifies it further, because some people might say, oh, well, you know, it's just because they couldn't get the actors to do it. But as I've said, Liz Shaw and Mike Yates, who are both companions of the third Doctor, well, maybe not Mike Yates as much, but they both appear, and then in the second Doctor, even more so, Zoe Harriott and Jamie McCrimmon appear in it, so you'd think that they do with these more memorable companions of the time. Yeah. But then we got on to, I think the biggest issue with a companion I have is Carol Ann Ford, because in this story she's playing Susan, but she's reprised her role. But in the 60s, Susan was a kid, and so she's a bit whiny as a kid in it, but you can get a pass. But at this point in time, she's not like 40 years old, something like that, and so it doesn't look that good where a weird little girl, a weird 40-year-old woman's going around shouting grandfather, grandfather, and it amplifies it up where Susan doesn't really seem to understand the concept of regeneration in some of the scenes. And obviously at the time she was filming, there was no such thing as regeneration, so if she hadn't really followed the show after that, it would make sense. But it's just odd as she's portraying Susan, as Susan is a Time Lord, it's a bit odd that Susan doesn't understand the concept of regeneration. Yeah, and then the final thing that I think is arguably, these other things are flaws, but you can let it pass. But this is arguably the worst thing in the whole story. And I rewatched this the other day, and I couldn't remember this happening, but it really upsets me as a thing, as it's just existing. So, Hartnell back in the 60s was obviously maybe not up to scratch stage. Like in today's standards, Hartnell's Doctor could be seen a bit racy towards women and maybe not the best. But I think he does it a couple of times, but there's only 1 or 2 times where he might do it. There's like maybe in Dalek Invasion of Earth, I think he does it once, and he does kind of tell Susan to shut up in a couple of episodes. But apart from that, he doesn't really seem to do very much. He's not very rude to people, and I think there's a point where he does stand up to Polly, not to Polly, but stands up for Polly in one of the stories. So Hartnell was actually quite a nice person, and he did stand up for women by the end of his run. However, in this, Herndl's just been literally he's like, nah, I'm just gonna make him as sexist to women as possible. It's just odd because it's also, he's, rather than him being sexist to women, he's sexist to human women, because when he's been with Susan for the whole time, and he's been nice to Susan, he's just been accepting of Susan. Has he not been like, Hartnell was really only mean to Susan, he wasn't really mean to Barbara, wasn't mean to Vicky, he wasn't really that mean to Polly or Dodo or Katerina, but he was mean to Susan. And then this, he's not really that mean to Susan, but then the minute he steps into the TARDIS with Peter Davison and Turlough and Tegan, he's so rude to Tegan. He makes gestures about how she should bring refreshments for the Fifth Doctor, because he's not very well. And then when she says she's trying to show him that she can do stuff by wanting to go out the Fifth Doctor and then wanting to go back out with him to go to the tomb of Rassilon, he's just like, oh, if you have to, then you might as well come, rather than being like, okay, well, yeah, sure, you can come. And it's just, there's a point where I actually thought, wow, he's being so bad that Peter Davison steps in, the Fifth Doctor steps in, but there's a point where I'm like, is this the Fifth Doctor stepping in, or is this Peter Davison going, oh, come on, slow down, Hurnell, you're being a bit too far, because he really does, he just really is quite bad in this, and I feel like some people view this as okay, because I got quite angry at some people who'd watched this and said it was fine, but then watched Twice Upon a Time, where David Bradley plays the First Doctor, and was quite rude about his performance, because I think his performance was maybe not as reflective as wasn't 100%, no, because no one can no one can replace Hartnell, no one will be able to recapture what Hartnell has, but I think David Bradley arguably does a better job than Hurnell does, and it is quite upsetting to see. So yeah, that's been my review of the Five Doctors. I think there's definitely flaws in it. And it's not the best story ever, and there's a couple of things where you could be like, well, yeah, that would have worked better, and that would have worked better. I think definitely compared to the Three Doctors, it doesn't really hold up as well, especially when you realise that the Three Doctors isn't a perfect story, but Hartnell and Troughton's comedy between each other is great. Whether in this, none of the Doctors are really together. I mean, Davison and Hurnell get a couple of scenes together, and then they get off until they don't meet again until the end of the story, and it really drags it down. So, yes, it's a great story. It's great in terms of giving fans like a good, this is this, and this is like referencing this, but it's not the best story ever. However, obviously, these multi-Doctor stories do quite well, returning to in the Colin Baker's run, not for an anniversary or anything, but Patrick Troughton does appear one more time, and in his last story, which is the Two Doctors, which at this point just makes me think, considering he's been 3 multi-Doctor stories, that these are just additional Hartnell, Troughton stories. And then obviously in the new series they carried over. So multi-Doctor stories will always be a thing, and whilst it's not my favourite story, you've got to give Five Doctors credit where it's due, because it is a really fun story and it is an interesting story, but if you look at it too hard, you can start to see cracks. Like, it's not some stories where there are issues with it, but they're really difficult to tell. There is like really easy to see issues. But yeah, that's just my opinion. If you have enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and go watch something else. But yeah, see you.